It is Hall of Fame season across Major League Baseball Network, and today the inductees will be announced for the class of 2025. So I'm going to bring you my official, unofficial ballot for my vote for the 2025 Hall of Fame. Now, let's get into it. What's going on, baseball fans? Jeremy Laracuente here for the Baseball Banter Broadcast. And in bringing you my official, unofficial ballot, I'm going to adhere to the same rules that the BBWAA, the Baseball Writers Association of America, follows and adheres to. So there is the ruling of players that have less than 5% of the ballot falling off the order. And I will be using that to my advantage in my ballot. We also look at the fact that you can maximize 10 picks, and that's exactly what I'm going to be doing. So there are several different tiers that I have in terms of the qualifications and the groupings here for Hall of Fame. So we're going to begin with the easy ones, the no doubt Hall of Famers. Now, when it comes to the no doubt Hall of Famers, we have to begin with the guy who is likely going to be the first unanimous position player picked, and that is Ichiro Suzuki. Obviously, thinking about the candidacy of Ichiro is an easy case to make for the Hall of Fame, but when you look at his numbers, there's even more reason to believe that. When you look at his numbers in America alone, he had 3,089 hits, but if you combine that with Japan, and obviously the Hall of Fame will not, but this is a guy who had 4,300 hits in his professional playing career. Obviously, the National Baseball Hall of Fame is only going to look at his time in the MLB, but regardless of that, this is a player who, without question, is a Hall of Famer. 10-time Gold Gloves with that 3,000 hits. He hits all of those criteria, those golden number metrics that the old school baseball writers and even the new school ones can all agree this player belongs in the Hall. And for Ichiro, I think that he lands, obviously, as a Mariner. Now, as we look at the second player on my list, who I believe is a shoo-in on his first ballot, it is CC Sabathia, and going in my opinion, as a New York Yankee. When you look at what Sabathia is, there's no doubt about it for me that CC is a guy who, without question, just looking and thinking about it back historically, is a Hall of Famer. When you examine his numbers, obviously there's a bit more of a case to be made, and also a case to be made for other players that were on this ballot who have similar career numbers, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But looking at what CC had for his career, over 3,000 strikeouts, over 250 wins, this is a guy who was a durable beast and a workhorse on the mound. He helped carry the Brewers when he was traded there in 2008 to a postseason run, pitching multiple times in a row on short rest. Going into the 2029 season after signing on with the New York Yankees, helped carry the Bronx Bombers to their first World Series title since 2000 and their last one to date. When you look at what CC is, the big left-hander is without question to me a Hall of Famer. Now, I'm going to be getting into a ballot position later with one of the players that is similar in terms of numbers to CC, but I'm going to state a case here for Andy Pettitte. Now, obviously, Pettitte did not make my list this year, as you're going to see, but there's a case to be made, especially when you compare his numbers to that of CC Sabathia, just how close Pettitte's case truly is, and if not for the admission of using HGH in 2007 when he was with the Houston Astros, another stain on the franchise's legacy, but when you look at what Pettitte was, and if you factor in his postseason dominance, there's little question that there's a true case to be made for Andy Pettitte. And if I had more room and not limited to just 10 spots on my unofficial ballot, Pettitte likely would have gotten my vote this year as well. Now, as we get into another player that is without a doubt in my mind a Hall of Famer, it is Carlos Beltran. And for me, he likely goes in as a New York Met. When you look at what Beltran was able to do, there's little question this is a guy who is without a doubt a Hall of Famer. A switch hitter who is arguably one of the best switch hitters to ever play the game. And what he did on both sides of the baseball, being able to be a Gold Glove caliber defender, being able to be an offensive force in the middle of the order, and being able to have the mind and the mentality that he had going into studying pitchers, studying the game, and understanding how that all worked out. Obviously, the biggest knock against his career, and why, in my opinion, he hasn't already been enshrined in Cooperstown, is the 2017 sign-stealing scandal with the Astros, as he was named as one of the head figures of creating the scandal. But there's little question when you look at what his career was. It spanned a tremendous amount of time in which he was an excellent to a highly above average player. When you look and think about the fact of his time with the Kansas City Royals as a 22-year-old, all the way to being an all-star at the age of 39, there's little question that the longevity that this player had, with the talent that this player had, and his mental acumen for the game, his baseball IQ was through the roof. This is a Hall of Fame caliber player, and it's something that was very easy for me to decide on. Now, as we get into the fourth player that is on my no doubt Hall of Fame ballot, and this is absolutely mind-bending to me how he has not already been enshrined in Cooperstown, and it's a bias against the position in my opinion, but it is Billy Wagner. When you look at Billy Wagner and what the level of dominance that he had and what he was capable of doing on a nightly basis when he would come out of that bullpen, was get outs furiously. This was a strikeout master. And if you really want to get technical about it, this was a pitcher who was more dominant than the second highest closer rate, the second highest closer in terms of saves for his career in Trevor Hoffman. Billy Wagner was better. Yes, that may sound crazy to say, but if you discount the number of saves and you discount the number of innings that separated them, Billy Wagner was much more dominant. When you look at Billy Wagner's career, it's been marred by the fact that he was a reliever, that he had less than 1,000 innings. But when you look at guys that were highly capable relievers, it is Mariano and Billy Wagner in terms of pure dominance. Yes, Trevor Hoffman is without question, in my opinion, a Hall of Famer, and it is not a knock on Trevor. But a simple fact is that when you do a side-by-side comparison of Billy Wagner and Trevor Hoffman, Wagner blows Hoffman out the door outside of the number of saves and the innings pitched. Billy Wagner should have been a Hall of Famer long before his final year on the ballot, but hopefully this is the year that the baseball writers finally get it right. Now, as we get into the next category that I look at, it's the numbers merit his inclusion in the Hall of Fame, and it is Andruw Jones. When you look at what Jones was for his career, yes, it was a high peak caliber player. And when you look at the tail end of his career, that to me is why he's been marred and knocked so highly across his time on the ballot. But if we are looking at Major League Baseball's Hall of Fame and looking at this era and this generation, this to me is one of the players, and I'll get into more of this in just a moment with my next category, but this is one of the guys who we have to examine the peak of their power. And this was a player that for a decade was one of the greatest center fielders that we had ever seen. Yes, injuries marred his second half of his career, and he was not the same player. He was not the same caliber of presence at the plate, in the field, or anything of the sort. But in that first decade, coming up from a 19-year-old with the Braves in the World Series making waves, there's little question about Andruw Jones' ability. Andruw was able to do things that other center fielders were just not able to do during his era. 400 home runs, 10 gold gloves. Without question, to me, Andruw Jones belongs in the Hall of Fame, and hopefully the baseball writers of America can get it correct. Now, as we get into the next category on my list, it is defined their era. And there's two players on that list to me that really defined their era and help us try to redefine this era of the Hall of Fame. Now, I'm going to get on my soapbox here really quickly, but when it comes to examining the Hall of Fame, a lot of the times baseball writers and baseball fans will only look at the top echelon of guys. And when you compare a guy like Bobby Abreu to, let's say, a guy like Roberto Clemente, he does not match up. But when you look to examine him in the context of not only the players maybe towards the middle half and not even the lower half of the spectrum in terms of his peers in his age group, his peers in his position group. But when you look at those guys in that bracket, you start to see very similar feats and abilities and numbers for Bobby Abreu. I've always overlooked Bobby Abreu, and this was the first year that he is actually making my ballot. But in a closer examination, and especially when you examine the times that we're in, if you compare them to the top, they're always going to fail. But if you do that through this era of balloting and this era of players on the ballot, we'll never see another Hall of Famer. You have to examine him in the context of his era. And in looking at what Bobby Abreu was able to do for the longevity of his career, this was a well above average player. A guy who peaked and performed in such a high caliber level. This was an on-base machine for his entire career. This was a guy who was an above average defender and someone who was able to help his teams win ball games. And for me, being able to put Bobby Abreu's name on this Hall of Fame ballot felt long overdue after examining his numbers this year. That's why he makes my list. Now, the other guy that is on my list for this era in terms of defining it is Chase Utley. Now, Chase Utley is a guy who some may not see as a Hall of Famer because the second half, the tail end of his career, he was mostly a platoon guy, wasn't an everyday talent. But when you look at what his numbers dictate, when you look at what his capabilities were during his time, during his era, this was at one point feeling like one of the best top 5 players in baseball. And yes, there was not an MVP to his name. But when you look at what he did, there was not a gold glove to his name. But when you look at what he did, a guy who capable of every night providing you with solid defense that may not have flashed the world, right? And I have my own bone to pick when it comes to gold gloves. But this was a guy that you believed in. If the ball was hit to him, you did not fear. Yes, there were obviously going to be errors that happens to everyone. But when the ball was hit to Chase Utley, Philadelphia Phillies fans did not fear. When you wanted a guy at the plate that was going to really provide you with a solid at-bat, a guy who you felt could come up in the clutch, Chase was that guy. As a Yankee fan, watching Chase Utley against the New York Yankees in that 2009 World Series was gut-wrenching every single time he stepped to the plate. And when you look at his career, that's exactly the kind of guy he was. This is one of the more underrated talents, in my opinion, when it comes to Major League Baseball. And for me, Chase Utley was an easy pick when his name came on the ballot. And when you look at his context, again, looking at the context of him against his peers of his era, in the context of deciding who belongs in the Hall of Fame, Chase Utley belongs in the Hall of Fame. Now, the next category on my list is better than you remember. And the biggest player in my mind when it comes to the better than you remember category is none other than Torii Hunter. This is a player that, as the numbers are trending right now, is going to fall off the ballot this year. And the 5% rule is not why I'm voting for Torii Hunter on my unofficial ballot. But when you look at what this 5% rule does, it eliminates guys much earlier than they deserve. Guys like Bernie Williams, Jorge Posada, Kenny Lofton deserved to be on the ballot for a much longer look. But they were knocked off with this 5% rule. There are tremendous players that have been overlooked because of not getting 5%. Now, obviously, there's the argument to be made that the 5% rule, if you can't get 5% of the ballot, then you don't deserve to be in the Hall. But when you look at the fact that there are 28 names on this ballot, and we've had ballots in the past when those guys were on that were even more crowded because of the overload of guys from the PED era that nobody wanted to vote for, there's no doubt that these overloaded ballots are part of the reason why this 10-player voting limit is what's hindering a guy like Torii Hunter. Yes, people are going to overlook what he was able to do. But when you think and you look and examine his numbers, this is a guy who won 9 straight gold gloves, was a tremendously impactful player for his teams and a winning player. In examining these numbers, I found a very interesting stat. Torii Hunter is one of only 43 players in Major League Baseball history with over 2,400 hits and over 350 home runs. Of those 43, only 13 are not in the Hall of Fame. Of those 13, 7 have PED ties or suspicions, and is most of the reason why they're not in the Hall already or not going to be. Of the other 6, 2 are not yet eligible to be on the Hall of Fame ballot because they just recently retired in Albert Pujols and Miguel Cabrera. They will be, without question, shoo-ins, first ballot, easily going into the Hall of Fame. So then, of that 6, that now leaves 4. One of which is Carlos Beltran, who is trending in the right direction to go into the Hall of Fame this year. So that leaves 3. Torii Hunter, and 2 guys who I believe should be in the Hall of Fame in Dwight Evans and Jeff Kent. So of the 43 players in Major League Baseball history with over 2,400 home runs and over 350 RBIs, we're excluding 3 guys that merit inclusion in the Hall of Fame. I will continue to champion my case for Torii Hunter until inevitably he falls off the ballot this year, because he is currently trending under 2% with the publicly known ballots, according to Ryan Thibodeau's ballot tracker. So we're going to have to wait and see how a Veterans Player Committee is going to feel about the case of Torii Hunter. But to me, there's little question Torii Hunter deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. Now, the other player that is better than you remember falls into a category all his own, and that is injuries mired this tremendous player, and that is David Wright. When you look at what David Wright's numbers are, this is a guy who had a high peak at the beginning of his career, and then injuries derailed the entire second half. But if you look and you examine his numbers, again, at the context of his era, but also as a peak perform guy, this is a player who, in my opinion, is very highly rated in terms of what he does for the Hall of Fame. Yes, looking at it last year, I added David Wright for the reason of the 5% rule. And currently, he is trending close to that limit as well. At the time of this recording, he was about 11%. But David Wright, to me, if you look at his career for the peak that it was a dominant, high-level player. This was a guy who was nicknamed Captain America for that 2006 USA WBC team. This is a player who, for me, is without question, when you examine those numbers in the context of his era, a guy that if he had stayed healthy would have been a shoo-in for the Hall of Fame. Yes, his numbers are a borderline candidate. And if he had had more time playing healthy, he would have been able to do better. But this was the guy who tried to battle through his injuries because he wanted to be on the field. He craved being on the field, trying to help his Mets win everything. And in doing so, in my opinion, he did more damage to himself than taking a little time to heal up. But he battled, he grinded, he wanted to be out there for his team. And ultimately, those injuries are what stopped him from being able to do just that. David Wright has the makings of a player that, if you examine his numbers, and especially in comparison to a guy who, coming up on the ballot in a few years, Buster Posey, he shines just as bright. Yes, Posey is going to be a guy who has other accolades to add to his campaign and his resume that David Wright just didn't get. But to me, if you examine the numbers of a guy who many believe is a shoo-in in Buster Posey with David Wright, there's a lot there that is very, very similar. And if you believe in Posey, then you got to believe in David Wright. Now, as we get into the final category, this was a very highly debated vote for me, as there are 2 players that are in danger of falling off. And that's what this last category is about. And it is preserving his time on his candidacy and giving it more time to deliberate. and that is Mark Buehrle. Mark Buehrle, when you examine his numbers, as I said earlier about Andy Pettitte and CC Sabathia, he's just on the same par level as both of those guys. Yes, the time and longevity is going to be something that plays into Buehrle's favor. This was a guy who pitched 14 straight seasons of 200 plus innings for his team. This was a guy that helped the 2005 Chicago White Sox get to and win the World Series. For Mark Buehrle, this is a player that was a absolute dog of consistency. This was a workhorse. You knew what you were getting from him year in and year out. And for me, his candidacy is being overlooked. He's currently trending at 13% at the time of this recording. And we know that the way that the ballots work, that every single time when all the ballots are announced, these guys fall quite a few percentage points. And my fear is that a guy like Mark Buehrle is going to find himself sitting on the outside of the 5% rule and find himself falling off the ballot when his case deserves a longer look. Mark Buehrle may not have been the dominant player that CC Sabathia was for the regular season. He may not have been the dominant pitcher that Andy Pettitte was in the postseason. To have that to his credit, to have that to his resume, to put those accolades on him. But this was a guy that, especially for his era, was seen as one of the best. You wanted outs quickly, it was Mark Buehrle. Yes, there's going to be a lot to be said about several players on this ballot. I'm leaving off Felix Hernandez, who, again, if this was a longer balloting pool opportunity with more than 10 votes, would have got my vote. There's another guy who was really the deliberating factor between he and Buehrle for me is Dustin Pedroia. Dustin Pedroia, much like with David Wright, is a guy who injuries marred his second half, marred his capabilities of being an easy, without question, Hall of Famer. I would love to be able to put Dustin Pedroia on my ballot, and that's coming from a Yankee fan for a career Red Sox. But watching Pedroia on a nightly basis was a guy that you feared because he played all out. Dustin was a guy who you absolutely wanted to do well because he played with so much love for the game. He played with so much heart, so much passion. There's little question to me that Dustin Pedroia deserves a much longer look. And again, in examining him in the context of his era, yes, injuries marred his career and are likely going to be the reason why he falls off the ballot as well at some point over these next coming couple of seasons, because he, like Buehrle, is trending at around 13%. But for me, the 10-player limit for voting ballot made it so that Buehrle, who's on the lower end of that 13% spectrum, is the guy that has to get my vote, to be able to keep him on the ballot to further examine his candidacy. But if we had a list that was four players longer, there's no doubt in my mind that I would vote for Buehrle, Pedroia, Pettitte, and King Felix. But I want to hear from you, baseball fans. Who are the 10 players that you would vote for on this year's Hall of Fame ballot? Do you disagree with any of my selections, or do you agree? And let me know those thoughts down in the comment section below, as we continue to try to build up this community, and fan engagement is something that we look forward to. Make sure you keep it locked in to this YouTube channel by hitting that subscribe button and the bell for post notifications, as we have a ton of more content coming for you this year. And make sure you keep it locked into MLB Network tonight at 6 o'clock when they begin their coverage and announcement of who are going to be the inductees for the 2025 class of the Hall of Fame. Thank you. Make sure you follow me on social media, on X at @banter_baseball, everywhere else at Baseball Banter Broadcast, and I will catch you guys on the next video. Peace.